What is up, you guys? So for today we'll be checking out Cyberpunk. Then let's see how it will perform on Acer Nitro 7 with 1660 Ti i5-9300H with 32 gigs of RAM running on dual channel. Now when you run the game first, it will actually check your hardware and just set the graphics preset on whatever it thinks your PC can run. On this setup, it sets the graphics preset to high by default. So this is gonna be the high preset, and it actually performs quite well. The game runs on 40 to 50 frames per second, but of course there's gonna be dips when there's a lot of things happening on your screen, like gunshots, explosions, NPCs running around, cars bumping around, and etc. So just by running around, you can see that there's some areas on this city that will have the impacts on the frames. So right now we're on 42 FPS, 41, 40, but just by running around, it doesn't really go down to below 40 FPS, which is fine for this area here. But on some crowded areas, it will dip to below 40, like around 35 FPS, but it should still be playable. So let's try to drive around. So just by driving around, it dips down to 39 FPS for 1 second, but it recovers itself to 40 FPS after that. So it's dipping down to 39 for 1 second, and now as you can see, it dipped down to 31 FPS for half a second, and it recovered itself to 40 FPS. So there's some frame dips on the game. So let's try to roam around. So as you can see, it's now around 36 FPS on this area here, and it's dipping down. We can see the frame is dipping down to 26 FPS just by looking up. I believe this is because of the reflections, just causing a big hit on frames. So let's stop here and just roam around. So let's try to run around and go up the overpass. So just by running around, it's just gonna be around 40 to 50 FPS, but when you're driving on the city and there's gonna be a lot of things happening on the screen, it will dip down to 31 FPS. That's gonna be the worst case scenario. Okay, so let's change the setting to medium. Of course, just by setting to medium, we can see there's gonna be a huge boost in FPS. As you can see, it's now around 56 FPS, and the changes on the graphics is barely noticeable. When you don't have an eye for detail, and just by playing the game, you don't really see that much of difference. So let's try to run around this area, and let's try to drive again on Night City. So as you can see, it's 51 FPS, 44 FPS on this area here. So just by looking up, it has a big dip on the FPS. So let's try to look up. As you can see, it's dipping down to 30 FPS. I do believe CD Projekt Red can still patch the performance and optimize it by updates. So let's turn around and just roam around again in this area here. So it's now around 38 FPS, 43 FPS, and it's now around 35 FPS. So we can see that the reflections has a big hit and impact on the performance of this game. Shadows, reflections. So just because it's night, the reflections, the shadows is gonna be very visible, and it has a big impact on the frames of the game. So let's try to roam around again. So you can see the game is very detailed. The NPCs, the textures, the models, the cars, it's very detailed. Now let's change the settings to low, and let's see how it will impact the game and its frames. So you can see there's gonna be a big difference from low to medium. Sorry, from medium to low. So that's the textures. You'll know at first glance it's gonna be low quality. Uh, the 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 shadows, it's pretty much non-existent,
So, looks like we found
and the
the mastermind behind this
reflections
city.
has been
Her
impacted.
name's Anna Hamill, and whatever she's investigating, it's made her a lot of enemies. She'd do best to cut it out if you catch my drift. Okay, look, I know how it sounds, but somebody would have taken this gig anyway, right? I don't know.
Even
Maybe
though we
there's an angle
changed
you can
the
play here. Either way,
even though
info's
we
attached.
changed the preset to low, you can still see that it's still running below 40 FPS on some areas, especially on here, this area here where the reflections are very heavy. So as you can see that it went down to below 30, it went down to 29 FPS just by driving on this area right here. So even though it's on low settings, the game still looks very good. Let's try to have some gunfights on this preset. Okay, there's some police areas here. So it's maintaining around 50 FPS on gunshots. So let's call our vehicle and just run away, and let's change the settings to ultra. Although we are at low settings, we can still see some frame drops on specific areas. So on this, as you can see, just after we have passed the tunnel, it went down to 37 FPS, and after that it recovered to 40 FPS, and just by there we saw that it's still dropping down to below 40 FPS. This is quite disappointing, especially that the game has been pushed back multiple times because of performance issues. But I guess this is still very acceptable, especially on how Watch Dogs Legions performed on its launch day. And still up until now, it's still running badly on this laptop. Okay, enough about that one. So let's change it to Ultra. So if you're wondering, after Ultra, it's gonna be Ray Tracing Medium and Ray Tracing Ultra. These last two settings doesn't really run good on this laptop. As you all know, 1660 Ti doesn't have a lot of tensor cores, and when we try to run this setting, it will be not playable. It will be on below 20 FPS. So as you can see, there's gonna be a little bit of difference from high and ray tracing medium setting, because the ray tracing medium just impacts the reflections on the game, and it has a very big hit on the frames. So it's very unplayable for 1660 Ti. So we can only play low, medium, high, and ultra settings. So for ultra, it's gonna be playable. Basically, the performance on ultra, it's gonna be console. Like it's gonna be around 30 FPS to 40 FPS. But it's still gonna dip down to below 30 on certain areas. So let's go back on that area where it's dipping down to below 30. So let's just run. Okay, so it's not dipping down to below 30 for some weird reason. Okay, let's go back. Okay, so as you can see, it just dropped down to 28 FPS. So it's now on 33 FPS. So 30 FPS, 29 FPS, 28 FPS. So as you can see, it's dropping down to 20 FPS for like 2 seconds, and it recovered itself after that. So there's some frame dips, probably acceptable, but yeah, it's just noticeable, very noticeable on some areas. Now, on this game, there's a very interesting setting called Dynamic Fidelity FX CAS, where when you turn on the setting, it tries to target the FPS that you have set here, and it will try to reduce the resolution just to achieve the frames that you have set here. So you can set this to up to around 240, given that your monitor supports 200 frames per second. So this laptop only supports 60 FPS, so I can only set it to 60 FPS for it to be noticeable. So what happens is whenever the game runs below 60 FPS, the game will reduce its internal resolution just for it to try and achieve 60 FPS stable. So I just turned that on. So just show you again. So I'm gonna set it to ultra and just turn on the FidelityFX CAS and just set it to target 60 FPS. So if I exit this, as you can see, it's gonna be around, still gonna be around 42 FPS. So it doesn't really help that much. But the resolution is below 1080p. So let's try to drive around. So just by having this setting, it kind of helps, but not that much.
What's shaking, Night City? Your man Stan here. Where is the division between man and machine?
So it looks probably like 40p, and it's trying to make the frames per second stable, but it cannot reach 60 FPS. So let's try to change our setting to high, and let's see if it can reach stable 60 FPS just by reducing that to high. So as you can see right now, so it's trying to achieve 60 FPS, but it can't. So it's gonna try to lower its resolution. So as you can see, it's going blur. So just by changing the setting, it doesn't go down to below. Nope, it's still going down below 20 FPS. So that setting doesn't really help that much for achieving stable 60 FPS. However, it does make the frames a little bit stable. So let's turn this off. So you can see the difference of the resolutions just by turning it off. So it's just night and day. It's super crisp on 1080p, but the frames will still be dropping to below 20 on certain areas, which I believe that can be fixed on future updates by CD Projekt Red. So I think this will be all for this video. Like and subscribe if you like it. Just thumbs down if you don't like it. And leave a comment. Thanks for watching.